In the 8 or 10 years you worked on this book, did you have a target? Did you have a purpose? Did you have a point of view you were aiming at in this study of death and how Americans coped with death, processed death in the Civil War? Did you have a target for this?
Well, David, it's an interesting question because there have been a couple of reviews of this book that have said, I depoliticize the war and I don't pay enough attention to the purpose for which soldiers fought, to the notion of a cause, and in particular to the notion of emancipation and freedom and union. And I was a little surprised by that because I certainly didn't mean to not pay attention to those questions. But I think what motivated me came from a different direction. And it's related a bit to what you said about Whitman, which was I wanted to get inside the eyes of those living through the war and restore the presence of death to our understanding of the war. Everyone who lived in 1860 is now dead, and they would have been dead whether or not there was a civil war. So in a sense, when we look back, there's nothing that's different about 1860 in that regard from the point of view of who survived. No one was going to survive till now. So I think we, in a sense, forget what it meant within the context of that time period itself. So as I thought about what I was doing in this book in response to reading those reviews, I thought that perhaps I was, and I don't mean to sound presumptuous, trying to make this book less a work of social science that was judging some argument about people's purposes or making some prescription about how we should regard war in our own time and whether we should undertake it or not. Less doing that than coming to this as a humanist and trying in some measure to do perhaps what a novelist might try to do, which would be to delineate the nature of a human experience. And so did that in part explain why perhaps some reviewers felt that I either didn't have a point of view or was adopting a point of view that I found very odd to think of adopting. Does that make any sense?
Sure it does. Well, maybe we could discuss that a bit. I mean, in a sense, then what is at stake if one alters the point of view of the American Civil War from, first of all, from the generals, from strategy, from the politics of the war, from the sense of cause on both sides? As you know, as everyone here knows, there's a huge literature on this subject, more books written on this subject than anything else in our history. What happens when you alter that point of view to the point of view of cemeteries, coffins, mourning, grieving, thousands of dead bodies on battlefields unattended, sometimes for weeks, families swarming to battlefields to try to find their loved ones? What happens when you alter that point of view, especially for the vast readership and the vast enthusiasm for this subject?
One thing that I would think would happen is that we might think a bit differently about late 19th century America, about post-Civil War America, because we have a nation filled with people who were in mourning, who in many cases had not even known the fate of their loved ones because so many of the dead were unaccounted for and simply missing in action. So you literally have tens of thousands of Americans who don't know what happened to their father, brother, son. And that's not something you get over quickly. One of the things I was struck by in reading letters and diaries is how many people just clung to some measure of hope. Maybe he just wandered off and he'll remember and come back someday. Or maybe I'll find the body someday. Someone will come across it and I'll be notified. This sense of expectancy tied up with grief that persisted in the minds of so many Americans. And as you pointed out, we were chatting just before we came down, the African Americans advertising well into the 1880s for lost loved ones from whom they'd been separated in slavery. So different dimensions of loss, uncompleted loss in the late 19th century. What does that mean about all the other things we know about the late 19th century if that was in the hearts and minds of so many people? So I think that's one thing. I think a second thing is that, and again, I was thinking about these reviews that said I didn't pay enough attention to the cause or the purpose. I think we have to understand the cost of war. That doesn't mean we should never enter into it, but we need to do so in a clear-sighted way. And this book perhaps restores that sense of balance to our understanding of the romanticization or the glorification of the war, and in a sense makes those who participated in it even greater heroes than they might otherwise have been, because this is what they lived through, and this is what their families lived through. So perhaps it makes the legacy of the Civil War, what it has done for us, freedom, citizenship, a united nation, makes us appreciate it all the more because it came out of this Republic of South.
Help us get our heads around the numbers here, the scale of what you call mass death and mass slaughter in this war. The numbers of the dead, the numbers of the unknown, and so on. Help us get our head around that.
Well, Louise mentioned the number that's the generally accepted number. 620,000 soldiers believed dead in the war. One of my chapters is about the difficulty of relying entirely on those statistics because of the failure of bureaucracy to actually keep the kinds of meticulous records that one might wish to have. But 620,000 seems a good estimate. It's probably somewhat higher than that. But nevertheless, what that represented was 2% of the population, the equivalent of 6 million dead Americans today. It's just unthinkable how this nation today would react to 6 million dead. And that does not include any kind of civilian death at all. And it's clear to me that civilian deaths were not a small number. There are just a variety of ways in which civilians did die as a result of the war. Perhaps from what today we might call collateral damage among those who live near battlefields, spread of epidemic disease in an era when that wasn't understood and large populations of military and non-military moved back and forth, spreading disease, shortages and hardships, particularly in the South, and the impact on health that those had, guerrilla warfare in parts of the country. So I think we need to imagine some considerable number of civilian deaths. And we should understand, too, that the death rate was quite differentiated north and south, and that the death rate was far higher in the South, so because they mobilized sizable armies from a very much smaller population. And it's estimated that about 18% of white men of military age in the South died in the course of the war. So that is a very high level of loss. And so we need to think about it in those terms as well.
And do I remember right that at least half of the Union dead died unknown? They weren't named?
Once again,
we're
not,
than half of the Confederates.
Yeah, we're not sure exactly the numbers, but if we put Union and Confederate together, it's probably more than half, around half or more than half of the dead were unknown, missing, unidentified. Nameless.
Yeah. You open the book with a wonderful chapter about the concept of the good death, of how 19th century Christian America had come to this belief in, I mean, there's a good death and a bad death. And then comes this war and collides with this idea of a good, what do you mean by the good death? What did they mean by the good death?
Well, the fundamental dimension of a good death was one at home. And so, of course, soldiers' deaths far from home were immediately not in that category of death. But it was a death that an individual undertook in the bosom of family, aware, conscious of dying, reconciled to death, expecting to live in the life to come because of professed Christian belief. It was a death in which last wishes could be expressed to loved ones. It was a death that was meant to be a kind of translation to another sphere where that individual would ultimately expect to be reunited with other kin.